But the losses that altered her most completely came in her adult years, when she was a wife and mother herself, old enough to measure exactly what each one cost. In January 1994, Jackie Kennedy Onassis received a diagnosis of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. She was 64 years old. The illness moved fast. She was gone by May, just 4 months after the diagnosis. For Caroline, the loss was not just the loss of a parent. It was the loss of the person who had been, in the deepest sense, the organizing force of her existence. Jackie had decided how the family would grieve. Jackie had protected her children from the worst of the public's appetite for their pain. Jackie had held the shape of the family together across decades when it could easily have come apart. Caroline was 36 years old, married to Edwin Schlossberg since 1986, a mother of 3, Rose, born in 1988, Tatiana, born in 1990, and John Jack, born in 1993. She was in the middle of her own life, fully formed, fully adult. And the person who had taught her how to be in the world was suddenly not in it. She did not disappear. She did not retreat. She kept going, because keeping going was what she had been taught. And then, 5 years later, on the night of July 16, 1999, her brother John F. Kennedy Jr. took off in a small plane from New Jersey headed for Martha's Vineyard. Carolyn Bessette Kennedy, his wife, was with him. So was Lauren Bessette, Carolyn's sister. The Atlantic that night was hazy, conditions different from what the flight required. Somewhere over the water, the plane went into a spiral. The Coast Guard searched through the night and into the following day. The bodies were recovered from the ocean 3 days later. John was 38. Carolyn was 33. Lauren was 34. John Kennedy Jr. had been, since before he could form memories, one of the most photographed people in the world. He was the boy who had saluted at his father's grave. He had grown up to be charming and handsome and genuinely intelligent, had started a political magazine called George, had married in a secret ceremony in 1996 on a remote island off the coast of Georgia, so carefully arranged that the secrecy itself became famous. He and Caroline had shared a bond that required no explanation because it had been forged before either of them could explain anything. They had grieved their father together before they understood grief. They had grown up together inside the strange, specific pressure of the Kennedy name. They had been the only two people who had ever lived that exact experience. And now Caroline was the only one. She was, at 41 years old, the last surviving child of John and Jackie Kennedy. She had lost her father before she started school. She had lost her mother when her own children were small. She had lost her brother, his wife, and her sister-in-law in a single night over the Atlantic. She said very little about any of it in public. Not because she was suppressing something or in denial, but because she understood, had always understood, had been taught to understand, that some things belong to the person who lived them, and the world's appetite for another person's grief is not a claim on that grief. This is the moment to say something important about who Caroline Kennedy is apart from what has happened to her. She is a woman of genuine intellectual and professional substance. She graduated from Radcliffe College and Columbia Law School. She co-authored multiple books on American constitutional law and civil liberties that are taken seriously in academic and legal circles. She worked at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. She founded the Profile in Courage Award in 1989, an honor given annually to elected officials who demonstrate the willingness to take unpopular positions based on moral conviction, the exact quality her father had celebrated in his 1956 book Profiles in Courage, the exact quality she has tried to live. She served as United States Ambassador to Japan under President Obama from 2013 to 2017, and later as Ambassador to Australia from 2022 to 2025. She raised 3 children. She sustained a marriage for nearly 4 decades. She built an entire life of meaning and service and accomplishment that exists completely independently of the losses she has endured. It is necessary to say that because it is true, and because the alternative, telling her story only as a series of tragedies, does exactly what she has spent her life refusing to do, it reduces a full human being to the worst things that happened to her. Now we come to Tatiana. Tatiana Kennedy Schlossberg was born on May 5, 1990, Caroline and Ed's middle child. She grew up in New York. She attended private school and went on to graduate from Yale University. She married George Moran in 2017 at the Kennedy family property on Martha's Vineyard, the same land where her parents had married, the same land that held so many layers of family history and joy and grief that it had become almost its own character in the Kennedy story. Tatiana became an environmental journalist. She wrote for the New York Times covering science and climate. She published a book called Inconspicuous Consumption, an investigation into the hidden environmental costs of the ordinary choices people make every day. It was well-researched, clearly written, and taken seriously by people who work in the field. She was, by all accounts, exactly the kind of person her brother Jack would later describe, smart and funny, like her mother, thoughtful and brilliant, like her father. She had 2 children, Edwin, born in 2022, and a daughter, Josephine, born in May 2024. It was shortly after Josephine's birth that a routine blood test came back with. Imagine standing in front of a crowd of hundreds of people, cameras pointed at your face, the whole world waiting to hear what you will say. And the thing you have come to say is your dead daughter's name. Not because anyone forced you to. Not because a publicist told you the timing was right. But because you decided, after 5 months of private silence, that your daughter deserved to be spoken about in a room that was built to honor courage. That is what Caroline Kennedy did on May 31, 2026. She walked to a podium inside the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library in Boston, and she said out loud what she had been carrying in private since December, and she did not flinch, and she did not fall apart, and she did not ask for anyone's sympathy. She just said the name, Tatiana. And then she sat down. And if you want to understand why that moment matters, why it moved an entire room to applause that lasted 20 full seconds, then you need to understand something about who Caroline Kennedy is, and what her life has actually looked like from the inside. Because the world has watched Caroline Kennedy her entire life. From the moment she was old enough to be photographed, she has been photographed. From the moment she was old enough to grieve publicly, she has grieved publicly. Or rather, she has grieved privately while the public watched. And what the public has watched, across nearly 7 decades, is something that defies easy description. It is not simply tragedy, though there has been extraordinary tragedy. It is not simply resilience, though the resilience has been extraordinary too. It is something more specific and more human than either of those words. It is what it looks like when a person decides, over and over again across a lifetime, that the people they have lost are worth honoring more than they are worth collapsing over. To tell this story properly, you have to start not in 2025 or 2026, but in 1963, because that is where everything begins. Caroline Lee Bouvier Kennedy was born on November 27, 1957, the first child of Senator John Kennedy and his wife Jacqueline. By the time she was 3 years old, her father was the President of the United States. By the time she was 5, she was arguably the most recognized child in America, photographed in the White House, photographed with her parents, photographed at play in a world that could not stop looking at this family. And then on November 22, 1963, in Dallas, Texas, 5 days before Caroline's 6th birthday, her father was shot and killed in a presidential motorcade. She was 5 years old. Her brother John Jr. was 3. Their mother Jackie was 34, and in an instant became the most watched widow on earth. The images from those days have never left the collective memory of anyone who has ever seen them. Caroline in a white coat at the Capitol, holding her mother's hand. John Jr. at the graveside, saluting. Jackie in black, composed in a way that should not have been humanly possible. These photographs became the defining images of an era. They appeared on the covers of newspapers and magazines around the world. They were replayed in documentaries for decades. They were studied by historians and mourned over by strangers. But inside those photographs were 2 real children experiencing the actual, concrete, non-symbolic loss of their father. A little girl who did not fully understand yet what death meant, only that her father was gone, and that her mother was wearing black, and that everyone who looked at her seemed to want to cry. Jackie Kennedy made a decision in those early weeks and months that shaped everything that followed. She would not let her children be consumed by the grief the world wanted to assign to them. She moved the family first to Georgetown, then to New York, working to create a childhood for Caroline and John that had as much normalcy in it as was possible given that their name was Kennedy and their father had been the president, and neither of those facts was going to change. She kept the press away with a discipline that required enormous effort. She hired tutors. She chose schools carefully. She worked to make sure that her children knew their father, his memory, his values, his intelligence, his warmth, without being flattened by the weight of what his death had meant to the country. Years later, Caroline Kennedy would describe her mother as the single most important influence in her life. Not because of what Jackie had accomplished publicly, though that was considerable, but because of what Jackie had modeled privately. The idea that you could survive the worst thing that could happen to a person, and that how you survived was a choice you made every single day. It would have been enough. The loss of her father. For most people, losing a parent at 5 years old to a public assassination that replayed on television for decades would represent the defining tragedy of a life. For Caroline Kennedy, it was the beginning of a pattern that no one should have to live. She was 15 when her grandfather Joseph Kennedy Sr. died in 1969. That same year, the Chappaquiddick incident involving her uncle Ted Kennedy sent shockwaves through the family's public standing that took years to recede. In 1975, Aristotle Onassis, the Greek shipping magnate her mother had married in 1968, a marriage that had scandalized much of the American public, but had given Jackie something she genuinely needed, died, leaving Jackie a widow for the second time. Caroline was 17. She had already lived through more disruption and loss than most people accumulate in a lifetime. Numbers that sent Tatiana and her doctors down a path no one wants to travel. Elevated white blood cells. More tests. And then the diagnosis, acute myeloid leukemia, a cancer of the bone marrow that is fast-moving and hard to treat, with a 5-year survival rate of roughly 30%. Tatiana was 34 years old. She had a newborn daughter and a 2-year-old son, and an entire life she had barely begun to live. In November 2025, she published an essay in The New Yorker. It is one of the most remarkable pieces of writing to come out of that year. Remarkable not because it is dramatic or emotionally overwrought, but because it is the opposite of those things. It is precise. It is controlled. It is the work of a journalist who applied to the hardest possible subject the same rigorous, clear-eyed attention she had always applied to her work. She wrote about the diagnosis and what it felt like to receive a terminal prognosis. She wrote about trying to stay present with her children when staying present required an act of sustained will. She wrote about climate change and the particular grief of someone who has dedicated her professional life to the future of the planet, knowing she would not be there for most of it. She wrote about watching her cousin Robert F. Kennedy Jr. be confirmed to lead the Department of Health and Human Services, the same person whose skepticism about vaccines she had spent years pushing back against professionally, while she herself was alive because of the medicine she trusted completely. And she wrote about her mother. She wrote about the instinct, cultivated over her entire life, to protect Caroline from pain, to not be the source of upset or worry or grief. And she wrote about the helplessness of dying, of knowing that no matter what she did or said or wrote or felt, she was going to add another loss to a life that had already carried more loss than it should have. She put it in a sentence that is very hard to read. For my whole life, I have tried to be good, to protect my mother, and never make her upset or angry. Now I have added a new tragedy to her life, to our family's life, and there's nothing I can do to stop it. Read that sentence again. A daughter facing her own death. Worried not about herself, but about her mother. Apologizing, not in those words, but in the feeling underneath the words, for the grief her dying would cause. That sentence is what happens when a child grows up watching a parent absorb loss after loss with dignity and composure, and internalizes, without anyone telling her to, the feeling that she must never be the one who adds to that weight. Tatiana had watched her mother grieve a father, a mother, a brother. She understood what grief had cost Caroline. And she was devastated that she was going to cost her more. Tatiana Kennedy Schlossberg died on December 30th, 2025. She was 35 years old. Her daughter Josephine was 1 year old. Her son Edwin was 3. Her husband George, her mother and father, her siblings Rose and Jack, everyone who had loved her gathered at the Church of St. Ignatius of Loyola in New York City to say goodbye. The family statement was brief and said everything it needed to say. Our beautiful Tatiana passed away this morning. She will always be in our hearts. Caroline Kennedy said nothing publicly about her daughter's death for 5 months. She appeared at events. She continued working. She gave interviews about the Kennedy Library and the Profile in Courage Award and her father's legacy. She did not avoid the public. She simply decided, as she has always decided, what was hers to share and what was not. And then on May 31st, 2026, she decided that she was ready to say Tatiana's name in the room Tatiana had served, the Kennedy Library, where Tatiana had been a board member. And so she went to the podium, and she paused for just a moment, and then she said what she had come to say. Most of all, we remember Tatiana, who served on the board of this library and represented everything my parents stood for in her beautiful, amazing, and too short life. The people in that room understood what they were witnessing. They were not witnessing a performance of grief. They were witnessing a woman choosing, as she has chosen her entire life, to honor the people she has lost rather than be defined by losing them. They applauded for 20 seconds. Not because a speech had been particularly eloquent or because a moment had been staged for maximum emotional impact, but because a mother had just said her daughter's name in public for the first time, 5 months after the funeral, in a room full of people who knew what that had cost, and the only thing left to do was acknowledge it. Kennedy historian Stephen Gillen noted after Tatiana's death that the particular shape of Caroline Kennedy's losses, the father, the mother, the brother, and now a child, is not just tragic. It is singular. There is almost no comparable pattern in modern American public life. And what Gillen and others have observed is that Caroline Kennedy has carried this weight without it reshaping her into someone defined by bitterness or withdrawal or performative suffering. She has remained, across all of it, someone who shows up, someone who does the work, someone who says the names of the people she has loved, clearly and without drama, and then continues. Her son Jack, who announced a run for Congress in New York's 12th District in late 2025, carries forward something of what his mother has always embodied. The conviction that public service is worth the cost, that the Kennedy legacy is not just a name, but an obligation. Tatiana's children, Edwin and Josephine, will grow up knowing their grandmother as the woman who outlasted every tragedy the family has faced and kept showing up anyway. They will one day read their mother's New Yorker essay and hear Tatiana's voice in it. They will read the sentence about not being able to stop the tragedy, and they will understand something profound about the family they were born into and the woman who raised their mother. There is an old photograph from the White House, taken just days before Dallas in November 1963. President Kennedy is at his desk. Caroline is 5 years old, knee-high, absorbed in her own small world, not yet knowing what is coming. Nobody in that photograph knows. The image endures because of the distance between what the people inside it feel and what the person looking at it knows. It is a picture of innocence on the verge of rupture. Caroline Kennedy is 68 years old now. That little girl in the photograph has become a grandmother, an ambassador, an author, a daughter who outlived her parents and a sister who outlived her brother, and now a mother who outlived her child. She has done all of this, carried all of this, and she has not disappeared. She stood at a podium and said a name and sat back down. She is going to stand up again. She has always stood back up. That is who she is. And no amount of loss, it turns out, not even this, has been enough to change that. What makes Caroline Kennedy's story genuinely different from other stories of grief and survival is not the scale of the losses, though the scale is extraordinary. It is the consistency of her response to them. Most people, when they lose someone, eventually arrive at a new normal. They rebuild. They adjust. For Caroline Kennedy, there has never been a stable new normal to rebuild toward. Each time something resembling equilibrium appeared on the horizon, another loss arrived to dismantle it. And yet she has never allowed the accumulation to become an excuse. She has never said, publicly or apparently privately, that she has been given more than she can carry. She has simply carried it. Tatiana understood this about her mother. That sentence in the New Yorker, the one about trying her whole life to protect Caroline and never make her angry or upset, is the sentence of someone who grew up watching a woman absorb blow after blow and respond not with collapse,